There is a moment you know well. It is early. Maybe the light is just beginning to come through the window. Maybe it is still dark. You are awake, and something inside you feels different. Something feels possible. You think about your goals. You think about how far you have come and how far you still want to go. And in that moment you feel it. That quiet, powerful sense of determination. You feel ready. You feel like this time is going to be different. So you begin. Maybe you start working out. Maybe you begin waking up earlier. Maybe you commit to writing every day, or reading, or building something. A business, a habit, a better version of the life you are already living. Whatever it is, you begin with energy. You begin with intention. And for a while, it works. The first few days feel good. You are doing the thing. You are showing up. And there is a kind of satisfaction in that, in the feeling of being someone who does what they say they will do. But then something shifts. It does not happen all at once. It rarely does. It is more like a slow loosening. One morning you wake up and you do not feel it. That feeling from before. That readiness, that fire. It is quieter now. You think maybe tomorrow will be better. Maybe if you just rest today, you will come back stronger. So you skip. Just once. And skipping once is fine. You tell yourself that. You tell yourself you are being realistic, that you are listening to your body, that consistency does not mean rigidity. And that is true. But then tomorrow comes, and somehow it is even harder to begin again. Because now there is a gap. And the gap has a weight to it. And as the days pass, that weight grows heavier. Before long you are back where you started. You know this moment too. It is the moment you look at your goals and feel a complicated mix of things. Frustration, maybe. A little embarrassment. A quiet voice that says, why can't you just stay on track? Why does this keep happening? And here is what is important to understand about that voice. It is not telling you the truth. It is not giving you an accurate picture of what is actually going on. Because the reason most people struggle with consistency is not a character flaw. It is not laziness. It is not weakness. It is something far more understandable and far more fixable than that. Most people struggle with consistency because they are relying on the wrong thing to keep them going. They are relying on motivation. And motivation, as you may have already discovered, is not reliable. It comes and goes like weather. It surges when things are new and exciting, and fades when the newness wears off. It returns sometimes when something external reminds you of your goals. A video you watched, a conversation you had, a moment of clarity that struck you out of nowhere. But you cannot control when it shows up. You cannot summon it reliably, and you absolutely cannot build a consistent life on a foundation that shifts every few days. This audiobook is about something different. It is not about getting more motivated. It is not about unlocking some hidden version of yourself that never struggles. It is not about 10 steps to effortless discipline or waking up every day feeling ready to take on the world. This audiobook is about something quieter, something more durable. It is about what actually keeps people going, not the people who have it easy, not the people who were born with extraordinary willpower, but the ordinary people who show up day after day and slowly, steadily build something real. The people who are not always excited, who are not always inspired, who sometimes dread the very thing they have committed to doing, and who do it anyway. Not because of how they feel in the moment, but because of the system they have built around the action. You are going to understand that system by the end of this audiobook. You are going to see, clearly, why your previous attempts at consistency may have broken down. You are going to understand the psychology of inconsistency. What causes it, what feeds it, and what quietly dismantles it over time. You are going to learn how to build a structure that does not depend on motivation, how to reduce the friction that makes starting feel so hard, how to make your daily actions smaller and more reliable, and how to keep going calmly and steadily, even when nothing about the process feels exciting. But before we get there There is something you need to sit with first, because the pattern of starting and stopping, of beginning with fire and fading with time, is not random. It is not just bad luck. It follows a very predictable shape, and once you understand that shape, something important begins to shift. You stop blaming yourself for a pattern that is almost entirely the product of how you were approaching the problem, and you start to see a different way forward. So let us begin there. Let us begin with the cycle that almost everyone goes through, and why it is so hard to break. Not because you lack the capacity for consistency, but because no one ever showed you what consistency actually requires. Think about the last time you felt truly motivated. Really try to remember it. The feeling of it. Where were you? What had just happened? Maybe you heard something that struck a chord, a speech, a conversation, a line in a documentary. Maybe you looked at your life and had a moment of honest clarity. This is not where I want to be, and I am going to change it. Maybe something happened. A health scare, a lost opportunity, a birthday that made you aware of time passing. And in that moment, you felt something ignite inside you. That feeling is real. It is powerful. And it is also, unfortunately, almost entirely useless as a long-term tool. Not because motivation itself is bad. Motivation has its place. It can get you started. It can carry you through the initial energy of beginning something new. But as a foundation for consistency, as the engine that is supposed to drive you forward day after day, it is deeply, fundamentally unreliable. And the reason for this is not complicated. It is actually quite simple once you understand what motivation actually is. Motivation is an emotion, and emotions are not constants. They are responses. They shift based on how you slept, what you ate, what happened to you today, what you are worried about, what the weather is like, whether someone said something kind to you or something careless. Emotions are reactive by nature. They respond to the environment around you and the internal state within you. They are valuable signals, but they are not stable engines. When motivation is high, action feels natural. You do not have to push yourself very hard to begin. The doing feels almost effortless, carried on the momentum of wanting it, but motivation operates on a cycle. It rises and then it falls, every time, without exception. And when it falls, if action depends on motivation, action falls with it. This is the core problem. Not that motivation disappears. That is expected, and it is natural. The problem is that most people structure their consistency around motivation. They wait to feel ready before they begin. They push hard when motivation is high and rest when it is low. And this means they are essentially surging and stopping, over and over again, never building the steady accumulation of daily effort that actually produces results. There is a concept in psychology that helps explain this. It is called hedonic adaptation. It refers to the way human beings adapt to positive stimuli over time. When something is new and exciting, the brain releases dopamine, the neurochemical associated with motivation, anticipation, and reward. But as the novelty fades, so does the dopamine response. The brain adapts to the new normal. What felt exciting 2 weeks ago now just feels like something you do, and the motivational charge that came with the beginning is gone. This is not a flaw in your character. It is how the brain works. The brain is wired to respond strongly to new things and to normalize familiar things. This is actually useful in many contexts. It helps you stop being overwhelmed by the ordinary details of daily life. But it is terrible for sustaining enthusiasm about a long-term goal that requires daily effort. So what happens? The excitement of beginning a new workout routine fades after 2 or 3 weeks. The initial thrill of starting a creative project cools as the real work sets in. The surge of determination that came with deciding to wake up earlier becomes a familiar feeling, and familiar feelings do not produce the same motivational charge as new ones. And then there is the role of difficulty. When you start something new, the difficulty of it is often underestimated. You feel the potential, the excitement, the vision of where you could be. What you do not fully feel yet is the sustained effort required to get there. But as you continue, the effort becomes more visible. The gap between where you are and where you want to be can feel larger, not smaller, because you understand it better now. And this gap, this honest confrontation with how much work lies ahead, is one of the main places where motivation breaks down. It is not that you are lazy. It is not that you do not really want it. It is that the emotional high that made it feel possible has faded, and in its place you now have to do the work without that support. And for most people, no one has ever shown them how to do that. No one has taught them that this fading is normal, predictable, and not a sign that they should stop. Here is something worth understanding deeply. The people who appear consistent, the people you might look at and think they have something I do not, are not people who stay motivated all the time. They are not people who wake up every day feeling fired up and ready. Many of them will tell you that most days they do not feel particularly excited about what they are about to do. They feel ordinary. Sometimes they feel tired. Sometimes they feel like doing something easier. But they go and do the thing anyway. Not because they have stronger willpower than you, but because they are not waiting for motivation to begin. They have removed motivation from the equation. They do not ask themselves, "Do I feel like doing this today?" They simply do it, because it is what they do. That shift from action that depends on feeling to action that is independent of feeling is one of the most important internal changes you can make. And it is not something that happens through more motivation. It happens through understanding, through structure, through repetition, through building a relationship with your daily actions that does not require you to feel a particular way before you begin. Motivation will still visit you. It will still surge sometimes and feel good. And when it does, that is a gift. Use it. Ride the wave. But do not build your foundation on something that comes and goes with the tide. Build your foundation on something steadier. We are going to talk about what that foundation looks like. But first, we need to understand the deeper architecture of inconsistency itself, because the failure of motivation is just the surface. Underneath it are patterns, beliefs, habits, and psychological tendencies that most people never examine. And until those are understood, even the best structure in the world will eventually crack under the pressure of an unmotivated day. So let us go deeper. To understand why you stop, you first need to understand how the mind relates to effort. The human brain at its core is an optimization machine. It is always trying to find the most efficient path between you and whatever it determines is important. And the key word there is efficiency. The brain has a strong, almost instinctive preference for the path of least resistance. This is not a weakness. It is an evolved survival mechanism. In the natural world, conserving energy was essential. You did not waste effort on things that were not necessary. You rested when you could. You acted when you had to. But here is the complication. You are living in a world that has changed far faster than your brain has adapted to it. Your brain is still running on ancient software, and while that software served your ancestors well in a world of genuine scarcity and physical threat, it is not particularly helpful when you are trying to build a creative practice or sustain a fitness routine or work on a project that will not pay off for months, because in that context, the brain's default is still to conserve, to avoid the effort that feels unnecessary, to drift toward whatever is easier, more familiar, more comfortable. And in a world full of easy, comfortable, instantly gratifying options, your phone, your couch, something to eat, something to watch. This default tendency has more to choose from than it has ever had before. This is why starting something feels harder than continuing it, and why continuing it feels harder on some days than on others. The brain is not working against you, but it is also not automatically on your side when it comes to long-term, delayed gratification work. Understanding this is the beginning of working with your brain rather than constantly fighting against it. Now let us talk about something that sits at the heart of inconsistency. Something that does not get discussed nearly enough. It is called the intention-behavior gap. The intention-behavior gap is the distance between what you intend to do and what you actually do. Research in behavioral psychology has shown, consistently and across many different domains, that people are remarkably poor at translating good intentions into actual behavior. You can intend with complete sincerity to exercise tomorrow morning and then not do it. You can fully mean it when you say you are going to write every day and then go 3 weeks without writing. Not because you lied, not because you did not care, but because intention and behavior are governed by different parts of your mind, and they do not always cooperate. Intention lives in the conscious, deliberate, goal-oriented part of your thinking. It responds to what you value, what you aspire to, what you believe matters. Behavior, on the other hand, is heavily influenced by habit, environment, emotion, and the conditions that exist in the moment you are supposed to act. And when those conditions are not set up to support the behavior you intend, the gap between intention and behavior widens. This is why the advice to just try harder rarely works. More effort, directed at the same structure that is already failing, does not usually produce a different result. What changes results is changing the structure, changing the environment, changing the conditions that exist in the moment of action. But before we get to solutions, there are a few more psychological patterns worth understanding. The first is what psychologists call present bias. Present bias is the tendency to overvalue what is available to you right now and undervalue what is available to you in the future. It is the reason you eat the dessert even though you wanted to eat healthily. It is the reason you scroll your phone when you meant to go to sleep early. It is the reason the relief of skipping today's effort feels more real, more immediate, and more compelling than the benefit of the consistent behavior you are trying to build. The future version of you. The one who has exercised for 6 months, who has written consistently, who has built the skill, feels abstract. Distant, not quite real, but the present feeling of tiredness, resistance, or desire for ease is completely real right now, in this moment. And present bias means that in any head-to-head competition between present comfort and future benefit, present comfort wins more often than it should. This does not mean you are short-sighted. It means you are human. And understanding this tendency is important because it helps you see why consistency cannot depend on willpower alone. In the moment of decision, the part of your brain that wants the easier option is always going to make a persuasive case. You need systems that reduce the need for that the moment decision to even occur. The second pattern is what is called the planning fallacy. This is the tendency to underestimate how long, how difficult, or how much effort a task or goal will require, while simultaneously overestimating how much progress you will make in the early stages. The planning fallacy is why people set ambitious schedules that quickly become overwhelming. It is why the New Year resolution to exercise 6 days a week often collapses by February. It is why people commit to a daily creative practice, struggle to maintain it at the level they imagined, and interpret that struggle as evidence that something is wrong with them. Nothing is wrong with them. They just set up a plan that did not account for the reality of daily life, its interruptions, its varying energy levels, its competing demands. The solution is not more commitment. It is more realism, smaller commitments, simpler plans. Systems that are designed to survive the bad days, not just the good ones. The third pattern is perfectionism, and this one deserves particular attention because it disguises itself so convincingly as a virtue. Perfectionism, in the context of consistency, is the belief that if you cannot do something fully, completely, and at a high standard, it is better not to do it at all. It sounds like standards, it sounds like quality, but in practice, it functions as a very efficient trap that keeps you from doing the work. Because real life is rarely perfectly set up for the task you want to do. Some days you will only have 10 minutes instead of an hour. Some days your energy will be low and your output will be mediocre at best. Some days the conditions will be imperfect in ways you could not have predicted. And if perfectionism is in charge, all of those days become lost days. Days where you did not try because trying under these conditions would not produce the result you imagined. But here is what perfectionism costs you. It costs you the accumulation, the quiet, steady building that happens when you show up even imperfectly, day after day. Because 200 mediocre writing sessions produce something that one perfect session never could. Because 10 minutes of movement every single day, compounded over months, produces a real change in your body and your relationship to your physical self. Because the act of showing up, however imperfectly, is itself a signal to your brain, a signal that this is what you do, this is who you are. And that signal, repeated hundreds of times, becomes something deeper than motivation. It becomes identity. There is also something worth understanding about how resistance works. Resistance is the internal force that arises whenever you are about to do something that is uncomfortable, effortful, or uncertain. It shows up in many forms: procrastination, distraction, sudden interest in a less important task, the feeling that now is not quite the right time, the belief that you need to feel more ready, more prepared, more inspired before you can begin. The author Stephen Pressfield wrote extensively about resistance. He described it as something almost alive, something that is most intense precisely in the direction of your most important work. And in that observation, there is something very useful. The presence of resistance is not a sign that you should not proceed. It is often a sign that you are pointed in exactly the right direction. Most people interpret resistance as a stop sign. Something is hard, so it should be avoided. Or something feels wrong about beginning right now, so you should wait until the feeling passes. But the feeling rarely passes on its own. Resistance does not dissolve with time. It dissolves with action. The moment you begin, not perfectly, not with full confidence, but simply begin, resistance begins to loosen. It does not always disappear completely, but it loses its grip. The momentum of having started changes your experience of the task. This is why starting is often the hardest part. Not the work itself, the act of beginning, which leads to an important understanding about how the brain relates to tasks that have not been started versus tasks that are already in progress. There is something called the Zeigarnik effect, a psychological phenomenon in which incomplete tasks occupy more mental space than completed ones. Your brain tends to stay engaged with things you have started but not finished. And this means that getting started, even in a small and imperfect way, is often enough to engage the brain's sense of investment. Once you are in it, even partially, the brain is more willing to continue than it was before you began. So if you are someone who struggles to start, the answer is not to wait until you feel ready. It is to make the starting so small, so easy, so low stakes, that the part of your brain that resists cannot mount an argument against it. You are going to learn how to do that. In detail. Practically. In a way you can begin using immediately. But there is one more piece of the psychology worth understanding before we move into practical territory, and it has to do with identity. There is a difference between trying to build a habit and being someone who naturally does that thing. When you try to build a habit, you are imposing a behavior from the outside. You are telling yourself, I should do this. I need to do this. I am going to try to do this. And every time you have to do it, there is a negotiation, a moment where you have to convince yourself to perform a behavior that does not yet feel natural to you. But when a behavior is connected to how you see yourself, to your identity, the negotiation is much smaller. If you see yourself as someone who exercises, the question is not whether to exercise. It is simply when and how. The action is an expression of who you are, not a task you are trying to complete. This shift in identity is not something you manufacture by wishing. It is something you build by doing. Every time you show up, every time you perform the behavior, even when it is inconvenient, even when it is imperfect, you cast a vote for that identity. You accumulate evidence that you are the kind of person who does this. And over time, that evidence shapes how you see yourself, which makes the next action easier, and the one after that. The accumulation works in the other direction too. Every time you skip, every time you let resistance win, you cast a vote for the identity that says you are someone who does not follow through. That identity is also built slowly and quietly, and it makes the next skipping easier. This is not meant to create guilt about past failures. You were operating with the tools and understanding you had at the time, but now you are building a clearer picture of what is actually at stake. It is not just about whether you exercise today. It is about what you are telling yourself about yourself through your daily actions. And that is something worth taking seriously. There is something deeply counterintuitive about the way results actually accumulate. We live in a world that tends to celebrate the dramatic, the big transformation, the sudden breakthrough, the overnight success story, even when we know, rationally, that no success is truly overnight. We are surrounded by highlight reels, in the media, on social platforms, in the stories people tell about themselves. And those highlight reels almost always skip the part that matters most, the long, quiet, unremarkable middle, the part where nothing looks like progress, the part where the work feels repetitive and the results are invisible, the part where most people stop. Because here is what the highlight reel never shows you: the 6 months of daily writing that happened before anyone noticed, the 2 years of consistent training that built the body people admire, the thousands of hours of practice that made the skill look effortless, the daily, ordinary, unglamorous showing up that preceded everything that looks extraordinary. Real results, the kind that last, the kind that change your life, are almost always the product of sustained small actions, not dramatic bursts of effort, not exhausting sprints of intensity followed by collapse. Small, steady, daily. And the reason for this is mathematical before it is anything else. There is a concept called compounding. Most people understand it in the context of money. If you invest a small amount regularly over many years, the returns do not grow in a straight line. They grow exponentially. Each period of growth builds on the last. And over time, the accumulation becomes something that would have seemed impossible if you had tried to predict it from the beginning. The same principle applies to habits, skills, and daily efforts. A 1% improvement, repeated every day for a year, does not produce a 37% improvement. It produces a 370% improvement. Not because each individual day is dramatic, but because the effects stack. They build on each other. The progress you made yesterday creates a slightly higher platform from which you make progress today. But compounding has a quality that makes it psychologically difficult to trust. And that quality is invisibility. In the early stages of consistent effort, you cannot see the compounding happening. The changes are too small. The differences from one day to the next are essentially imperceptible. You write every day for 3 weeks, and the improvement in your craft is genuine, but if you compared the writing from day 1 to the writing from day 21, you might struggle to see it clearly. You exercise consistently for a month, and your body is genuinely adapting. But those adaptations are happening at the cellular level, not yet visible in the mirror. This invisibility is what kills most people's consistency. Not laziness, not lack of desire. The honest, reasonable, human difficulty of continuing to invest in something whose returns you cannot yet see or feel. It feels like nothing is working. So you question the approach. You wonder if you should be doing something differently, something more dramatic, something that produces faster visible results. Or you simply lose the thread of motivation because the feeling of progress is one of the things that keeps motivation alive, and without visible progress, that feeling fades. Here is what you need to hold on to in those invisible early stages. The work is working. The compounding is happening. You just cannot see it yet. Think of it like pushing a heavy stone. In the beginning, the stone does not move. All that effort, and nothing seems to be changing. But you are not pushing in vain. You are building up pressure. You are pushing against a static object, and every push is adding to the force that will eventually shift it. And then, at some point, not when you expect it, not according to any schedule you planned, the stone begins to move. Slowly at first. But once it is moving, it becomes easier to keep it moving than it was to get it started. Momentum has its own logic. This is what consistency builds. Not just skill, not just habit, but momentum, a direction, a trajectory, and trajectories, once established, have their own pull. But for any of this to work, the daily actions need to be the right size, and most people, when they begin, set them too large. This is worth spending real time on, because it is the place where more plans fail than almost anywhere else. The size of the action matters enormously. Not just in terms of whether you can complete it, but in terms of whether you will begin it, whether you will keep it up through the difficult days, and whether it can survive the inevitable interruptions that life brings. When the daily action is too large, several things happen. First, the barrier to starting becomes high. Before you begin, you have to mentally prepare for a big effort. You know it is going to take a while. You know it is going to require sustained energy, and on the days when your energy is low, and those days will come, that high barrier is enough to make you stop before you start. The action required to begin feels too heavy to lift. Second, the action becomes contingent on ideal conditions. A 1-hour workout requires a 1-hour block of time, adequate rest, the right equipment, and enough willpower to sustain the effort for 60 minutes. A 10-minute walk requires almost nothing. One will happen most days. The other will be skipped whenever conditions are not quite right, and conditions are not quite right on a lot of days. Third, when you skip a large commitment, the psychological cost is higher. You did not just miss 10 minutes, you missed an hour. The gap feels significant. The sense of failure is proportional to the size of the missed commitment, and a large sense of failure makes it harder to begin again. So what does the right-sized action look like? It looks almost embarrassingly small. If you want to build a reading habit, the action is not 30 minutes of reading every day. It is 1 page. If you want to build a writing habit, it is not 1,000 words. It is 1 sentence. If you want to exercise consistently, the minimum viable action is not a full workout. It is putting on your exercise clothes and stepping outside. This is not about settling for less. This is not about lowering your ambitions. This is about understanding the difference between the goal and the daily action that builds toward the goal. The goal can be as large as you like, but the daily action, the unit of consistency, needs to be small enough that it is virtually impossible not to do. Here is why this works. When the daily action is small, the threshold for beginning drops dramatically. Your brain does not mount much of an argument against 1 page of reading. It does not trigger a significant resistance response to 1 sentence of writing. And once you have begun, once you are in the page, in the sentence, in the movement, something often happens. You continue, because starting was the hardest part, and starting is now easy. The minimum commitment becomes the foundation from which more effort naturally grows. On the good days, the easy days, the high-energy days, you do much more. You write for an hour. You exercise for 45 minutes. You read 5 chapters, and that is wonderful. But the consistency is not built on those days. It is built on the days when you did not feel like it, and you did the small thing anyway. Because the small thing is always doable, even when everything else feels hard. There is a principle that helps anchor this understanding. It is sometimes called the minimum effective dose. the smallest action that still produces a meaningful effect. In medicine, this concept refers to the smallest amount of a medication that still produces the desired result without unnecessary side effects. In the context of daily consistency, it refers to the smallest action that still keeps your habit alive, still signals to your brain that this is what you do, still maintains the thread of identity that you are building, and maintaining that thread is the primary objective of the early stages of any new consistent behavior. Not producing impressive results, not covering a lot of ground quickly, just keeping the thread alive, showing up, making the action real, day after day, until it becomes the thing you simply do. There is something that happens when small actions are sustained over a long period that is difficult to fully appreciate in the abstract, but becomes unmistakable in experience. The nature of the effort changes. What was once an act of will, something you had to push yourself to do, becomes something more like breathing. Natural, automatic, not effortless exactly, but no longer requiring the kind of deliberate effort it once did. The action has become a habit, and habits, once formed, draw from a different cognitive reserve than effortful choices. The neuroscience here is worth understanding. Habits are processed in a part of the brain called the basal ganglia, a region associated with automatic behavior, pattern recognition, and procedural memory. When a behavior is repeated consistently over time, in a consistent context, the brain begins to encode it as an automatic pattern. It requires less deliberate thought, less decision-making, less willpower. It becomes what researchers call a habit loop cue, routine, reward. The cue triggers the routine automatically. The routine delivers the reward, and the loop reinforces itself. This is why it is nearly impossible to simply stop a bad habit without replacing it with something else. Because the cue still fires, and the brain still looks for a routine. But it is also why consistently performing a small action in the same context, at the same time, over many weeks, eventually makes that action feel like something you just naturally do. Small actions, sustained daily over months, rewire the brain. They literally change the neural architecture that governs your behavior. This is not a metaphor. It is physiology. The pathways associated with the consistent behavior become stronger, faster, more automatic, and the effort required to walk down those pathways decreases. This is the transformation that no one shows you in the highlight reel, not the dramatic before and after, not the moment of breakthrough, but the quiet internal reordering that happens when you keep doing the small thing, day after day, until doing it becomes more natural than not doing it. That is where you are headed. And it begins with the small daily action, the one that is almost too easy, the one you can do on your worst day, your most tired day, your most distracted day. That is the action to anchor your consistency to. That is where real change begins. You have probably heard the word routine before. Maybe it even makes you feel a little restless. Routines can sound like constraints, like the rigid scheduling of every hour, the loss of spontaneity, the mechanical repetition of a life that has no room for surprise. But that is not what routine actually is. At least, not the kind of routine that supports genuine consistency. Real routine is not about controlling every moment of your day. It is about creating reliable anchors, fixed points that hold your most important actions in place, regardless of what else is happening. It is about removing the need to make certain decisions each day so that your mental energy is available for the things that actually require it. Decision fatigue is a real and well-documented phenomenon. Every decision you make throughout the day draws from the same finite pool of cognitive resources. By the evening, most people's ability to make deliberate, aligned choices has genuinely diminished. This is not weakness. It is biology. And it explains why so many people make their worst decisions at the end of the day. Why the person who wants to eat healthily has no resistance left by 9 o'clock at night. Why the person who intends to work on their project can never seem to begin it after dinner. The decisions were already exhausted by the time that moment arrived. Structure, routine, reduces the number of decisions you need to make. When exercise happens at the same time every day, you do not decide each morning whether to exercise. You simply do what you always do at this time. When writing happens before you check any messages, it is not a choice you have to make each day. It is where you begin. The structure has made the decision for you. And in doing so, it has protected the action from the erosion of daily friction and fatigue. This is why structure is not a cage. It is a scaffold. It holds your most important behaviors up so they do not collapse under the weight of an ordinary, imperfect, demanding day. So how do you build structure that actually works? The first principle is simplicity. The simpler the structure, the more likely it is to survive. There is a temptation, especially at the beginning, to build an elaborate routine. Every hour has a purpose. The morning is a precise sequence of activities. The day is broken into perfectly proportioned blocks of deep work, exercise, rest, learning, creativity. It looks impressive on paper. It looks like the kind of thing a highly successful person would do. But elaborate routines are fragile. They depend on every piece going according to plan, and plans do not always go according to plan. Life is interrupting. Energy fluctuates. The morning that was supposed to go smoothly has a problem that needs immediate attention. The evening that was carefully scheduled gets derailed by something unexpected. And when an elaborate structure breaks down, even partially, the temptation is to abandon the whole thing and try again tomorrow. A simple structure is much harder to break, because even when some of it falls apart, the essential pieces remain, and the essential pieces are the ones that carry the most weight. So begin by identifying not the full structure of your day, but the 2 or 3 things that matter most for the consistency you are trying to build. The actions that, if done daily, would actually move you toward the life you are building. Not 10 things. Not a comprehensive self-improvement program. 2 or 3 things. Write them down if it helps. Look at them clearly. And then ask, when will I do each of these? Not if. When. The specificity of when matters more than most people realize. Research in psychology consistently shows that implementation intentions, specific plans that define when and where you will perform a behavior, dramatically increase the likelihood of that behavior actually occurring. Not vague intentions, not I will work out when I get a chance, but concrete, specific anchors. I will exercise at 7 in the morning before I check my phone. I will write for 20 minutes immediately after breakfast. I will read for 15 minutes before I go to sleep. The more specific the when, the more likely the behavior is to actually happen. Now, there is a question of morning versus evening, and when to place your most important actions in the day, and the honest answer is that it depends on you, on your natural energy rhythms, your work schedule, your life. But there is a strong general principle worth considering: important actions belong early. Not because mornings are magical, but because mornings are before the day has had a chance to take from you. Before the demands of other people, the notifications, the unexpected problems, the accumulation of small decisions, all of it arrives after you have begun your day. If your most important action happens first, it happens before the day can crowd it out. If it is placed in the evening, it is competing with 14 hours of life that have preceded it, and some of those days, those 14 hours will have used up more than you had to give. This is not a rigid rule. Some people are genuinely more alert and energetic in the evening. Some schedules simply do not permit morning action. But if you have flexibility, placing your anchor habit early in the day is one of the most reliable ways to protect it. The second principle of building structure is consistency of context. The brain is exquisitely sensitive to context. The same action performed in the same place, at the same time, with the same sequence of events surrounding it, becomes associated with that context over time. The context itself becomes a cue, a trigger, and that trigger begins to activate the behavior automatically before you have even made a conscious decision. This is why people who write at the same desk every morning, at the same time, with the same cup of coffee beside them, often report that they find it much easier to begin than when they try to write somewhere unfamiliar or at a different time. The context has absorbed the habit. It has become part of the cue. You can deliberately engineer this effect. Choose a specific place for your most important daily action. Return to that place at the same time each day. Keep the environment around that action as consistent as possible. Over time, just being in that place at that time will begin to pull you toward the behavior. The context does some of the motivational work for you. The third principle is designing for the minimum. You have already heard this, but it bears repeating in the context of structure because it is easy to confuse the structure with the ambition. The structure is not where your ambitions live. Your ambitions live in the direction you are moving. The structure is the vehicle, and the vehicle needs to be reliable, not impressive. This means your daily structure should be based on what you can actually do, not on what you wish you could do, or what you will do on the best days, but on what is realistic on the average day, the tired day, the difficult day. If you can write one paragraph every day without fail, structure one paragraph into your day. Not 1,000 words, one paragraph. If you can do 15 minutes of movement, structure 15 minutes. Not an hour, 15 minutes. The structure is not a ceiling, it is a floor. A floor you will almost never fall below. On good days, you will do far more. But the floor is always there, and the floor is what builds the habit. There is also something important about the transitions between your anchored activities and the rest of your day. One of the most common places that consistency breaks down is not in the activity itself, but in the space around it. The transition from waking up to the first deliberate activity. The transition from finishing work to shifting into personal time. These moments of in-between are where distraction most easily takes root. Where the phone gets picked up, the news gets checked. The 15 minutes that was supposed to lead somewhere instead become an hour of scrolling. You can design these transitions intentionally. A short, consistent ritual that signals the beginning of an activity helps the brain shift into the appropriate mode. It does not need to be elaborate. 3 deep breaths, a specific playlist, a glass of water, a brief written note of intention. Something that marks the beginning and creates a deliberate step from whatever came before. These small transitional rituals are underrated tools for consistency. They reduce the friction of beginning by creating a path, a clear, familiar sequence of steps between where you are and where you want to be. The fourth principle of daily structure is end design. Most people think only about how to begin their day well. But the way your day ends has enormous influence over how the next one begins. If your evenings are unstructured and consuming, if they are filled with passive, stimulating activity that runs late into the night, you will wake up depleted, with less capacity for deliberate action than you need. The morning that was supposed to be productive becomes a struggle against exhaustion and foggy cognition. Evening structure does not mean early bedtimes and no enjoyment. It means having some intentional design around the close of your day. A consistent bedtime, even approximately. A period before sleep that is calm and screen-free, or at least low stimulation. A brief moment of reflection. What happened today? What matters tomorrow? What you are grateful for? That brings the day to a clear close rather than letting it drift. These are not rigid requirements. They are design choices. And each one you implement makes the next morning and the next day's consistency slightly more sustainable. The fifth and perhaps most practically important principle is something called the 2-day rule. The 2-day rule is simple. Never miss more than 2 consecutive days of your anchor habit. Miss one day. That happens. Life interrupts. You are human. Miss 2 days in a row. It is still recoverable. You have not lost the thread. But missing 3 days, 4 days, a week, that is where the habit genuinely begins to dissolve, where the identity of being someone who does this thing starts to weaken, where it becomes harder to remember why you started. So when you miss a day, the only rule is this: tomorrow you return. Not with a grand restart, not with a vow of renewed commitment. Just quietly, without drama, without guilt, you return. You do the small thing. You keep the thread alive. That is the rule. 1 day off is rest. 2 days off is a warning. 3 or more days off is where you need to pay attention, not with judgment, with clarity. This is a system that works when you maintain it. And maintenance is always easier than rebuilding from the beginning. Structure is not something you impose on yourself once and then maintain effortlessly. It is something you return to. Something you adjust when it stops working. Something you protect when life threatens to dismantle it, and rebuild when it gets dismantled anyway. It is a practice, not a setup. And like all practices, it becomes more natural with repetition. If you want to understand why you do what you do, and why you do not do what you intend to do, you need to understand friction. Friction, in this context, is anything that creates resistance between you and the behavior you want to perform. It is the steps you have to take before you can begin, the decisions you have to make, the effort of setup, preparation, or transition, the physical or mental barrier that stands between your intention and your action. Friction is everywhere, and most people never consciously examine it. They simply experience the resistance it creates and interpret that resistance as a lack of motivation, a weakness of will, a sign that they do not want it enough. But often they want it plenty. They are just standing in their own way, surrounded by unnecessary friction that makes the behavior harder than it needs to be. The inverse of friction is ease, and ease is extraordinarily powerful. Behavioral economists and psychologists have studied what happens when you reduce the effort required to perform a behavior. The results are consistent and significant. Small reductions in friction produce surprisingly large increases in behavior. Placing healthy food at eye level in the refrigerator, not hiding it or locking it away, just moving it to eye level, increases its consumption substantially. Making it easier to begin exercise increases the likelihood that exercise happens, even when the exercise itself has not changed at all. This is because behavior is not purely a product of intention. It is also a product of the environment in which the intention meets reality. And if you can design that environment thoughtfully, if you can make the desired behavior easier, more accessible, more immediately available, you have done something that no amount of additional willpower could accomplish as reliably. So let us talk practically about how to reduce friction in your daily consistency. The first and most obvious category is preparation. If your workout depends on finding your gym clothes in the morning, and finding them requires opening 3 drawers and searching, that is friction. Not much friction, but enough to provide your resistance, seeking brain with one more reason to delay, one more small obstacle in the path between intention and action. The solution is simple. Lay out your gym clothes the night before. Put them somewhere visible, right where you will see them when you wake up. The clothes are now the first thing you encounter, and they are a physical cue. They point you toward the behavior. The friction of beginning has been reduced by a small preparatory action the evening before. This principle extends to almost any consistent behavior you want to build. If you want to write every day, have your writing environment already open when you sit down. The document, the cursor blinking, the page waiting, not 3 applications to open, not a blank desktop to navigate, but the thing itself already there. If you want to read every day, have your book open on your pillow, or on your desk, or in the place where the reading will happen. Not inside a bag, not on a shelf across the room. Physically open, immediately accessible. If you want to meditate in the morning, have your meditation cushion or chair already in the place where you sit. If you want to practice an instrument, have the instrument out of its case and accessible. If you want to eat more vegetables, chop them in advance and store them in a visible container. The amount of additional time any of this takes is minimal. The impact on your actual behavior can be significant. Preparation is a form of environmental design. You are arranging the world around your behavior so that beginning becomes easier. And when beginning is easier, it happens more often. The second category of friction reduction is simplification. Sometimes the friction is not physical but cognitive. The behavior is too complex, too multi-step, too open-ended for the moment in which you are trying to begin it. Consider the person who wants to start a journaling practice. They open a blank page and feel the weight of infinite possibility. What should I write about? What format should I use? What is worth writing down? This is cognitive friction, the uncertainty about how to begin, which creates hesitation, which creates the temptation to close the page and try again later. The solution is to reduce the cognitive overhead before you sit down. Define the format in advance. Maybe you begin every entry with the same 3 prompts. What are you grateful for today? What is one thing that happened? What do you intend tomorrow? The prompts are already there, waiting. You do not have to decide what to write. You just write what the prompts invite. The same principle applies to exercise. Instead of deciding each day what workout you will do, have a plan that you follow. Monday is upper body. Tuesday is a walk. Wednesday is lower body. The decision has already been made. The friction of deciding is gone. You just show up and do the thing on the plan. Simplification is about removing the cognitive steps between you and the doing. The more of those steps you can remove in advance, the lower the barrier to beginning. The third category is environmental cues. The environment is constantly sending you signals. The phone on the table says check me. The couch says rest. The TV says watch. These signals are not neutral. They are triggers that activate associated behaviors, often without your conscious participation. You can use this same mechanism in your favor by placing intentional cues for the behaviors you want to build. Put your yoga mat in the middle of your living room floor. When you walk through and see it, it is a cue to step on it. Put your book on your pillow. When you see it before bed, it is a cue to read. Put your journal on the kitchen table. When you sit down for your morning coffee, it is a cue to write. These physical cues do not force behavior, but they remind. They keep the intended behavior visible and immediate, rather than abstract and out of sight. And visibility has a profound influence on behavior. The inverse is also true. If you want to reduce a behavior, spending too much time on your phone, watching too much television, eating too many sweets, reducing the visibility of the trigger can reduce the behavior itself. Put the phone in another room during work hours. Put the remote control in a drawer. Keep the sweets on a high shelf rather than at eye level. The behavior is not impossible, but the friction has increased slightly. And a little friction, applied consistently, compounds in the other direction. You are the architect of your environment. Most people live in an environment that was not deliberately designed, that accumulated over time, shaped by convenience and habit, but you can redesign it. Room by room, shelf by shelf, drawer by drawer, you can shape the environment around you to make your desired behaviors easier and your unwanted behaviors slightly harder. This is not about willpower, it is about engineering. And engineering is more reliable than willpower. The fourth category of friction reduction is the art of making starting small, what some researchers call a gateway behavior. A gateway behavior is a tiny action that opens the door to a larger one. It is so small that resistance cannot mount a credible argument against it, and yet it is enough to begin the process of momentum. If the full action is a 45-minute workout, the gateway behavior might be put on your workout shoes. That is all. Not commit to the workout, not drive to the gym, just put on the shoes. Because once the shoes are on, you are already in motion. And the distance between sitting with your shoes on and stepping out the door is very small. If the full action is sitting down to write for an hour, the gateway behavior might be open the document and read what you wrote yesterday. That is all. Just read it. Because once you are in the document, reading, the natural next step is to add to it. The gateway has opened. If the full action is meditation, the gateway behavior might be sit in the chair. Just sit. No instruction to close your eyes, no instruction to breathe in any particular way. Just sit in the chair. And from the chair, the meditation almost always follows. The gateway behavior is not a trick. It is a recognition that starting is the hardest part, and that making starting small reduces the height of that initial threshold enough that your resistance cannot block it. There is one more dimension of friction reduction worth addressing, and it is perhaps the most powerful of all. It is the friction of the long-time horizon, when you are trying to build a consistent daily behavior over weeks and months. The psychological distance between now and the moment when the results will be visible can itself create a kind of friction. A resistance born of apparent futility. Why am I doing this today when I will not see any meaningful result for weeks? The solution to this kind of friction is not to speed up the timeline. The results will take the time they take. The solution is to shift where the reward lies. Instead of making the reward the distant outcome, the body, the skill, the finished project, make the act of showing up itself a source of reward, not by forcing artificial enthusiasm, but by genuinely acknowledging to yourself that you did the thing, that you showed up today, that the thread is intact. Some people do this by tracking their consistency visually, marking off each day on a calendar, watching the chain of completed days grow. There is a simple psychology behind this. The chain becomes its own motivation, not because the individual marks are impressive, but because the act of not breaking the chain becomes something you value, something you protect. The reward is not the outcome. The reward is the integrity of the chain. Others find that a brief moment of self-acknowledgement at the end of a completed day, just a quiet recognition that you did what you said you would do, provides enough immediate positive feedback to reinforce the behavior. Not celebration, not excessive praise. Just a simple, calm I did it today. That moment of acknowledgement is a real neurological event. It activates the brain's reward circuitry. It strengthens the association between the behavior and a positive internal state, and it makes the behavior slightly more automatic the next time around. Reduce the friction. Design the environment. Make starting small. Bring the reward closer. These are not motivational strategies. They are environmental and behavioral engineering. And they work not because they make you feel differently, but because they change the actual conditions in which your behavior occurs. At some point in your effort to stay consistent, you will have a day like this. You wake up and the feeling is not there. Not the fire, not the clarity, not the sense of purpose that made your commitment feel easy and obvious. You feel flat, maybe a little tired, maybe a little empty. The thing you have committed to doing is sitting there, waiting for you, and everything inside you wants to not do it today, not forever, just today, just this one day. And a voice comes in, quiet, reasonable, even compassionate, that says you deserve a break. You have been working hard. You can start fresh tomorrow. One day won't hurt. That voice is not your enemy. It is trying to take care of you in the way it knows. But it is also the voice that, if followed consistently, will quietly dismantle every commitment you have ever made to yourself. Not through one dramatic betrayal, but through 1,000 small, reasonable compromises, each one completely understandable in isolation. Together they form a pattern of not following through. This is where discipline comes in. Discipline is not the same as punishment. It is not harshness toward yourself. It is not the suppression of feeling or the denial of your humanity. Discipline, in its truest form, is simply the capacity to act in alignment with your values and commitments regardless of how you feel in a given moment. It is the gap between impulse and action. The space where you recognize what you want to do and choose to do what you committed to doing instead. This is harder than it sounds, because feelings are real. Tiredness is real. Resistance is real. The desire for ease is real. And the voice that suggests skipping is making a persuasive case in real time, backed by the full weight of how you actually feel right now. But here is the thing that discipline understands: that motivation does not how you feel right now, is not a reliable guide to what will serve you. The feeling in the moment is often the least trustworthy advisor available to you. Because feelings are shaped by sleep deprivation, stress, blood sugar, the weather, what happened this morning, are 1,000 factors that have nothing to do with whether your commitment to this goal is real and worth honoring. Discipline separates the decision from the feeling. It says, I already made this decision. I made it when I was clear-headed, when I understood what I was trying to build, when I could see the whole picture. I am not making this decision again today, based on how I feel right now. I am honoring the decision I already made. This reframe, treating your daily commitment as a decision already made rather than a decision to be revisited each day, is one of the most practically powerful tools in the psychology of consistency. Because if the decision is already made, the only question is execution. And execution does not require motivation. It just requires action. Now, discipline is a capacity that grows with use. Like a muscle. The first time you act despite resistance, it takes significant conscious effort. You feel the full force of what you are pushing against. But the second time is slightly easier. The third time, a little easier still. Not because the resistance disappears. It may remain, in various forms, for a long time. But because you have accumulated evidence that you can do this. Evidence that the resistance, though real, is not a stop sign, that you can feel all of it and act anyway. That evidence becomes its own resource, a kind of confidence not in your feelings, but in your capacity to act despite them. There is a related concept worth naming here. It is sometimes called the commitment device, a pre-made decision about how you will behave in a specific future situation, made before the emotion of that situation has any influence. Ancient navigators, famously, used to have themselves tied to the mast when sailing past the sirens. Mythical creatures whose song was so compelling that sailors would steer toward the rocks to get closer. The solution was not to resist the song in the moment. That would be impossible. The solution was to make a commitment in advance and make it binding before the song began. You can do the same thing, not by binding yourself physically, but by making decisions before the difficult moment arrives. Decide in advance what you will do when you do not feel like it. Decide in advance that the feeling of not wanting to is not a reason to stop. Decide in advance that you will do the minimum, the small thing, the gateway behavior, on every day, regardless of emotional state. These pre-made decisions are acts of self-trust. You are telling your future self, I know you are going to feel resistance. I know there will be days when everything in you wants to stop. I have made this decision for both of us. Just follow it. There is also something important to understand about the relationship between action and emotion, specifically about the direction of causality. We tend to assume that emotion precedes action, that you feel motivated and then you act, that you feel ready and then you begin, that you feel confident and then you try. But the relationship is actually more bidirectional than that. Emotion can precede action, but action also produces emotion. This is sometimes called behavioral activation, a concept from cognitive behavioral psychology that recognizes the power of behavior to change emotional states. When you feel low and you act anyway, when you get up and move, or create, or engage, your emotional state very often shifts. Not always dramatically, but it moves. The act of doing something creates a different internal experience than the act of continuing to feel what you feel while doing nothing. This means that waiting to feel like it before you act is often the opposite of what helps. Acting is frequently what creates the feeling. The motivation comes after the action, not before it. The momentum appears when you are already moving, not when you are still deciding whether to move. This does not mean you push through everything regardless of how you feel. Rest is important. Genuine depletion needs to be respected. There is a difference between the resistance that is simply the brain's preference for ease and the exhaustion that is a genuine signal from your body that it needs recovery. Learning to distinguish between those two is part of the practice. But in general, the rule of thumb is this: start. Whatever you feel, start. Start with the smallest possible version of the action. Start without any commitment to finishing. Start with the understanding that if, after beginning, you genuinely cannot continue, you have still done the most important thing. You have kept the thread alive. You have honored the commitment at the level of beginning. And beginning, as you are learning, is where most of the power lies. Discipline is not the absence of emotion. It is the presence of a choice that is larger than the emotion. It is the quiet, consistent practice of saying, "What I am building matters more than what I feel right now," and then acting accordingly. This does not make you cold. It does not make you robotic. It makes you someone who can be trusted by yourself. And self-trust, built through repeated acts of following through, is one of the most quietly profound things you can cultivate in your life. There is a particular kind of test that arrives somewhere in the middle of any long-term commitment. Not at the beginning, when the energy of starting still carries you. Not at the end, when the goal is close enough to feel real. But in the middle. The long, unremarkable, anonymous middle. This is where real consistency is built or broken, because the middle has no particular drama. There is no excitement of beginning, no adrenaline of a finish line approaching. There is just the work, day after day, the same thing or something very close to the same thing, repeated with what might seem, from the outside, like very little variation. And it can begin to feel like not enough. Like you should be further by now, like something must be wrong with the pace. This feeling is one of the most important things to understand about long-term consistency, because how you respond to it will largely determine whether you stay the course or quietly abandon something that was actually working. Nothing is wrong with the pace. The pace is the pace, and the pace is producing results, whether or not you can see them from inside the middle. Here is something that will help you hold on to that understanding when the middle feels long. Think of everything you have ever built, learned, or achieved that you are genuinely proud of. Now think about how it was actually made. Not the highlights, not the finished product, but the process. The days of practice before the performance. The weeks of training before the race. The months of drafting before the published piece. The years of learning before the mastery. Every single thing that is real and valuable was built through the middle. Through the ordinary, unexciting, often frustrating, often unremarkable accumulation of daily effort. There is no shortcut through the middle. The only path through it is through it. But there are ways to make the middle more navigable, and they are worth knowing. The first is what you might call measuring input instead of output. Most people measure their progress by outcomes, by results, by visible change, and outcomes are unpredictable. They arrive on their own schedule, influenced by factors you cannot fully control. If you are measuring your consistency by the outcome, the number on the scale, the revenue figure, the reach of your work, you will have a very unstable experience of your own progress, because the outcomes fluctuate regardless of the consistency of your effort. But you can control the input. You can control whether you showed up today, whether you did the work, whether you kept the commitment. And measuring that, tracking the input, gives you accurate, honest, daily evidence of your consistency, independent of how the outcomes are moving. When you track whether you showed up, rather than what the showing up produced, you give yourself a clean and daily experience of success. I showed up today, That is what I control. That is what I am measuring. And the showing up, sustained over time, will produce the outcomes. But the measurement of consistency should be the input, not the output. This is a subtle but significant shift in how you relate to daily effort. The second navigational tool for the long middle is finding renewal. Long-term consistency does not mean doing exactly the same thing in exactly the same way forever. It means maintaining the core behavior, the daily practice, the essential habit, while allowing variation and renewal in how that behavior is expressed. If you are exercising daily, the form of exercise can vary. If you are writing daily, the project can evolve. If you are learning, the subject can deepen or shift. The consistency is in the act of showing up for the practice, not in the rigid repetition of the exact same action indefinitely. Renewal is what keeps long-term consistency alive without turning it into something deadening. The core behavior is maintained. But within that behavior, you find new angles, new challenges, new layers. You deepen rather than merely repeat. And that depth keeps the engagement alive, keeps the practice meaningful, keeps you genuinely invested in showing up rather than just going through the motions. The third tool is patience, and specifically, a kind of patience that is not passive waiting but active trust. Active trust is the willingness to continue working when you cannot see the results, not because you are in denial about the absence of visible progress, but because you understand the nature of compounding. You trust the process not blindly, but based on understanding. You know what the process produces when it is sustained. You know that the results are accumulating, even when they are not yet visible. And you act from that knowing, day after day, with a patience that does not feel like resignation, but like confidence in a process you understand. This is different from hope. Hope is uncertain. Active trust is grounded in a clear understanding of how things actually work. And it is available to you now, if you choose to take it up. The fourth tool for long-term consistency is community and accountability. Though not in the way these words are often used. Community does not mean surrounding yourself with people who are doing the exact same thing you are doing. It means being in proximity, physically or virtually, to people who understand what it means to maintain a long-term practice. People for whom the concept of showing up regardless of mood is familiar and valued. People whose presence, stories, or perspective reminds you that what you are doing is not unusual, that the difficult middle is something others navigate too. That continuing is possible because others have continued. Accountability does not have to mean someone checking your results. It can simply mean telling one person what you are doing, not for their approval, but so that the commitment exists outside your own head. There is a psychological weight to spoken or written commitments that internal ones do not always carry. Not because you fear judgment, but because language makes intention real in a particular way. It draws the commitment into the external world, where it has a slightly different gravity. Some people find formal accountability, a partner, a coach, a group, genuinely helpful. Others find the external pressure less useful than the internal clarity that comes from simply writing down what they are committed to and reviewing it regularly. The structure matters less than the function, keeping your commitment visible, real, and connected to your current self, not just the self that made the decision a month ago. The fifth and perhaps most important tool for the long middle is learning to celebrate what ordinary actually means. Ordinary is not the opposite of extraordinary. Ordinary, sustained over time, is how extraordinary is made. The ordinary Tuesday workout, the ordinary morning of writing, the ordinary daily practice of the skill you are building. These do not feel significant on their own. They are not Instagram moments. They are not the things that make good stories at dinner parties. But they are, in aggregate, the entire story of your growth. Every good thing that you have built in your life, you built on ordinary days. You just did not see them as building days at the time. When you can begin to feel, genuinely feel, not just intellectually acknowledge, the weight of an ordinary day, something shifts. The daily action becomes something you do not take lightly, not because it is dramatic, but because you understand its place in the larger pattern. You understand that this ordinary Tuesday is part of the longest running project of your life, the project of becoming who you want to be. And that project does not require dramatic moments. It requires ordinary ones, repeated reliably over time. Long-term consistency is not glamorous. It is not the thing that gets highlighted or celebrated in the ways our culture tends to celebrate. But it is the thing that produces nearly everything worth having. And the people who have built lives, work, bodies, skills, or relationships that others admire, they have done so almost entirely through the quiet, sustained, ordinary practice of showing up and doing the work. Day after day, month after month, year after year, you are building that capacity now, one ordinary day at a time. You have traveled a long way through this audiobook. Not through geographical distance, but through something that often feels even harder to navigate. The inner territory of why we do what we do, and why we stop, and how we begin again. Take a breath here, a real one, slow and deliberate, because what you have encountered in these pages is not just information. It is a different way of seeing yourself and your capacity for sustained action. You began by recognizing a cycle, the starting and the stopping, the enthusiasm and the fading, the version of you that begins with fire and the version that quietly, often guiltily, steps away. You recognized that cycle not as a character flaw, but as a predictable pattern, one that almost everyone follows when they approach consistency, the way they were taught to approach it, by relying on motivation as the primary fuel. You understand now why that approach fails. Motivation is an emotion. Emotions are responses to conditions. Conditions change daily, sometimes hourly, and a life built on the fluctuations of emotional state is a life that will fluctuate. That is not a judgment. That is just how the mechanics work. You understand the deeper psychology now, the brain's preference for the familiar and the easy, present bias, the planning fallacy, perfectionism's disguise as standards, the way resistance presents itself as wisdom when it is, more often, just friction wearing a smart outfit. You understand the intention-behavior gap, the space between what you mean to do and what you actually do. And you understand now that closing that gap is not primarily a matter of trying harder. It is a matter of changing the conditions. You understand that small actions, done consistently, compound into results that no single dramatic effort ever produces. That the invisibility of early progress is not evidence that nothing is working. That the middle, long, unremarkable, ordinary, is not a dead zone, but the construction zone where everything real is built. You have a clearer sense now of how to structure your days in a way that protects your most important actions from the erosion of competing demands. You understand that simplicity in structure is not settling for less. It is the strategic choice that makes consistency survivable over the long term, that anchoring your habits in time and context gives your behavior somewhere reliable to live. That the two-day rule is not about being perfect. It is about never letting a gap grow large enough to threaten the thread. You have explored friction and discovered that it is not an obstacle you must overpower, but a design problem you can solve. That preparation, simplification, environmental cues, and gateway behaviors can change your relationship with beginning so dramatically that starting feels less like climbing a wall and more like stepping through an open door. You understand discipline differently now, not as self-punishment, not as the suppression of your humanity, but as the quiet act of honoring a decision you made when you were clear, honoring it even when emotion is making a case for something easier. You understand that action often precedes feeling, that you do not need to feel ready to begin. That beginning is frequently what creates readiness, and you understand the long game, the ordinary days, the middle, the active trust in a process you cannot always see working, The patient repetition that builds not just skills and habits, but identity. The slowly accumulated sense of being someone who does this, who shows up, who follows through. All of this is yours now, not as a set of rules to follow perfectly, but as a set of understandings to return to when you need them. Because you will need them. There will be days when none of this feels true, when the gap between where you are and where you want to be feels insurmountable, when the small daily action feels almost pointless, when the resistance is loud and the motivation is silent and everything in you is asking, what is the point? On those days you do not need inspiration. You do not need to find the fire again. You do not need to have a breakthrough or reach a new level of clarity. You just need to do the small thing, the one thing, the minimum, the gateway, the thing you can do even on the worst day, even when you feel nothing, even when you believe, temporarily, that it is not working. Because here is what you know now, even when you forget the showing up is the work. Not just the means to an end. The act itself is the work. Each time you show up is a completed act of consistency. It is a vote cast for who you are becoming. It is a brick placed in something that is slowly taking form, even when you cannot yet see the shape. You do not have to be consistent forever, in some vast and overwhelming sense. You just have to be consistent today, and then, when today is done, you are consistent tomorrow. That is all this is. One day, then another, then another. No grand transformation required. No peak motivation needed. No ideal conditions, no perfect schedule. No guarantee that the results will come when or how you expect them. Just you. Showing up, doing the small thing, keeping the thread, honoring the commitment. Not because you always feel like it, but because this is what you do. There will be mornings when you wake up and the feeling is back. That surge of readiness, that sense of possibility. On those mornings, ride it. Let the motivation add momentum to the action that was already going to happen. Let the good days be genuinely good, and there will be mornings when the feeling is not there. When you wake up flat or tired or simply uninspired, those are the mornings that matter most. Those are the mornings where consistency is actually forged. Not in the excitement, but in the quiet choice to do it anyway. In both cases you begin, quietly, without ceremony, without needing to be ready, without waiting for the right moment, because the right moment is not coming. The moment is just this one, right now, asking only that you take the next small step. You do not need to feel ready. You just need to begin. And then, when it is hard, when the resistance rises, when the voice says not today, you begin again and again, without drama, without guilt, without the need for perfection, without the need for anyone else to see it or validate it or be impressed by it. Just the quiet, steady, daily practice of showing up for the life you are building. That is how consistency is made. Not in a moment, not in a decision, day by day, action by action, ordinary Tuesday by ordinary Tuesday. That is the whole secret, and it has always been available to you. It is available to you now. Begin.